welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and my guest today is Dr. Emeran Mayer. Dr. Mayer is a distinguished professor of medicine at the Oppenheimer Center for the Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA. He is a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and expert on topics related to gut health and the microbiome. His last book was titled The Mind-Gut Connection: How the Hidden Conversation Within Our Bodies Impacts Our Mood, Our Choices, and Our Health. His latest book builds on this and is titled The Gut-Immune Connection. Dr. Mayer and I discussed a range of topics related to obesity and metabolic disease, hunger and food intake, diet and fasting, and how all of these things are related to our microbiome, the world of microorganisms, of bacteria and other things that actually live inside our bodies and interact with our metabolism to impact our health. I think there's a lot of stuff that people will find interesting in this podcast related to dieting and eating, related to general health and wellness topics, all centered around what we are learning about the microbiome. As always, if you enjoy the content on this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. You can like or download the audio-only version of the podcast on any major podcast directory. You can also watch a video version of the podcast on YouTube, so I encourage you to also like and subscribe there. And if you want to support the podcast further, you can become a patron on Patreon for as little as $2 per month. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Mayer. Professor Emeran Mayer, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks, Nick, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Yeah, we are excited to have you. This is going to be a really interesting set of topics, I think. Can you tell everyone, just to start, who you are, what you do, and what your new book is about?
So I've been a professor at UCLA for many years, decades, and I'm a gastroenterologist by training and a neuroscientist. In my research part, I've sort of combined gastroenterology with neuroscience in studying the brain-gut interactions, or brain-gut microbiome interactions. And so I've been interested in this topic my entire career, initially prior to the microbiome science exploding, but this is I've just added that component now to my longstanding research and concepts about the importance of that system. So, and I've just about to publish my second book, The Gut-Immune Connection. The first one was The Mind-Gut Connection, which was sort of at the beginning of our interest in linking the microbiome with the brain and the nervous system and psychiatric diseases. Now the new book takes it a significant step further. I mean, a lot has happened in those 5 years in terms of the science goes. But also I create this concept of the One Health concept, that essentially the health of our gut microbiome, our brain, is part of the health of the soil microbiome, the health of the plants, and ultimately the health of the planet. So it takes a much more global perspective on this.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating area that I've been hearing a lot more coverage of in the media and in the research world. This idea that the health of our gut and our microbiome is linked to what our immune system is doing, is linked to what our brain's doing. And it seems like a fascinating area that I actually don't know too much about. One of the basic things I wanted to ask you about in the beginning has to do with setting up the problem in some sense. So it certainly seems like people are basically getting unhealthier with time. When you look at things like obesity rates, and different metabolic diseases like diabetes, for example. It seems like these things are going up, and I'm pretty sure that they've been going up for a long time. But can you give us a sense for some of the statistics here? How have things like obesity and diabetes and related issues changed over the past few decades, and what kind of healthcare burden is actually there right now?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. I mean, we, as a population, we have gotten sicker. What the healthcare system, or really the disease care system, has done, it's been very successful in keeping us from dying. So our life expectancy and longevity, has been increasing, but only with the help of massive interventions of, pharmaceuticals, and seems now, with metabolic diseases that almost 100% of men over 60, should be on a statin based on the criteria that have been established. So it's almost become the norm that we're metabolically unhealthy, particularly when we age. And sort of people have been obsessed really with the longevity aspect. It's always been celebrated that longevity has increased in our society. Everybody now has friends or relatives who have lived in their hundreds, which was, when I grew up, kind of unthinkable, really. But if you really look at the cost of that accomplishment, it's tremendous, and it's it means good business for the pharmaceutical industry and also for the healthcare industry, which is, as I said, it's a disease care industry, very good in keeping people alive and doing all kinds of ever increasingly expensive tests. But ultimately, it's not making us healthier. And that applies both to, I would say, physical health and mental health. So we have a mental health epidemic with increasing suicide rates, particularly amongst younger people, increase in depression. Depression is projected to be one of the main health issue in the next couple of decades. Substance abuse, addiction is obviously killing more people than most other diseases. And then we have this epidemic of what's been called these chronic non-infectious diseases, which include all the metabolic diseases and the consequences, cardiovascular disease, some forms of cancer like colon cancer, neurodegenerative diseases. And those diseases it's kind of interesting. They're really not separate from each other. We in the medical system, we try to divide them up into all these categories. People are sent to different experts. For colon cancer, you go to the gastroenterologist. For Alzheimer's disease, you go to a neurologist. But in reality, when you look at it, I mean, they're all linked together. So the metabolic derangements that have happened, and I would say, you could say in the last, plus minus 75 years since World War II, really, if you look at the curves, there have been an increase in all these diseases, some faster than others, some of the most rapid ones. And part of that increase has been influenced by the changing definition. So like autism spectrum, for example, has had a dramatic increase in the last 40, 50 years, but it also has undergone different definitions and classifications. So it's hard to say what the actual rate of increase is. And some of these diseases have increased, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. They're sort of blamed on the increasing age and increasing life expectancy, but in reality, it's not a necessary consequence of getting older that you have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. It's again the metabolic derangements that people live with that makes that more likely that more and more people develop those diseases. And Yeah, I would say, it's an epidemic of chronic diseases that we are experiencing. This has been overshadowed clearly by the pandemic, a much more acute and visible problem that we have been the medical system incredibly effective in coming up with a solution with the vaccinations. But again, I mean, those pandemics are, in some ways, you can link them to this chronic disease epidemic as well, because people that have any of those chronic diseases have been more vulnerable to develop a more severe course of the COVID-19 infection, and are more likely to develop the long COVID complication, and a disproportionate number of people that have more of these comorbid conditions. So they go comorbid conditions, which I really, is hiding the fact that there are this network of interconnected diseases. And the reason it's important is because the reason these diseases are interconnected with each other is the dramatic change in lifestyle that has occurred since World War II, and particularly the diet. So sometimes not just diet, there's interactions of other factors as well, like decreased exercise, chemicals in our environment, and many other things. But I think diet has received the most attention in this, and we can talk about this, how that links these increasing diseases with each other, but also with our lifestyle. So,
so there's this chronic disease epidemic, and there's many different chronic diseases that have been going up over time. It sounds to me that there's a few different things I'm hearing here. It's almost like a perfect storm of various things, where our lifestyles are in general leading to an increase in various chronic diseases. That's obviously bad, because nobody wants a disease of any kind, but a chronic disease is also one, by definition, that you're going to be living with for a long time. And it seems to me that there's also a problem there, which is these things are sort of slowly developing, so they're almost less noticeable as an epidemic. It's not something like COVID, where one day we all of a sudden more or less had this brand new problem that was right in front of us. But these sort of chronic diseases have slowly crept up steadily over time, and in some ways you almost don't even notice that we're in the middle of such an epidemic.
And they're being normalized. Like you notice, for example, so with obesity, for example, if you look at images from the 50s in the US, and images today, it's obviously apparent that the average has greatly increased in obesity rates. And it's being normalized because, the media want to send a message that they don't want to exclude anybody with obesity. So like now in the news, in the advertisements, you always see obese people, as even with the pharmaceutical ads, that promote like statins or medications for high blood pressure or blood lipids, or diabetes. You don't see, slim people. They're always obese, and it's almost shown like the new normal. And I think it's a very dangerous trend. The media want to be politically correct. You don't want to discriminate anybody with obesity. I don't care about the cosmetic aspect of obesity. As a physician and scientist, I care about the metabolic implications, and that should not be normalized. It's just not.
So I actually have heard people in the media make claims, in some cases directly, that being overweight or obese is not actually unhealthy. So I just want you to be very clear. Is that true at all?
It's not true. I mean, there's not 100% link between obesity and metabolic disease. For example, many Asian populations, like in China, people have metabolic syndrome but are not obese, and that's a particularly dangerous situation because you don't even have any external warnings, signals that something's going wrong. But in general, I think in the U.S. population, and I often say this when I give a talk, somewhere in the country where, like in the middle of the country where you see more obese people than on the coasts. I often tell the audience, 40% in this room probably have a metabolic disturbance. Maybe not full-blown metabolic syndrome, but you're on the way towards that, and with all its implications for higher risk of chronic disease. So I would say in Western populations in the US, there's a pretty good correlation between obesity, definitely once it gets to, overweight is a sort of a heterogeneous group of people. There's many healthy people that are somewhat overweight. But in general, people who develop like type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome are overweight and obese.
One of the things I want to talk about up front too is hunger and food intake. It's simultaneously something that everyone's very familiar with because we all get hungry and we all eat. But at the same time, there's a lot more going on there than probably meets the eye for most people. So as a neuroscientist, what is hunger at a high level, and how is it actually regulated by certain key parts of the brain and body in a normal, healthy individual?
Yeah, so hunger is a sensation, a basic emotion that makes sure that we fulfill the metabolic needs of the body. And normally this is fairly tightly regulated. There's a release of a hormone in the stomach called ghrelin that stimulates appetite and makes people want to eat. It's really the only hormone produced in the GI tract that stimulates appetite. All the other ones are actually counter-regulatory, so they create satiety to make you stop eating. There's also insulin, increased insulin levels will stimulate appetite or even craving. But in terms of, if you stay with the GI tract, so ghrelin gets to the brain, gets into reward areas, stimulates the release of dopamine, which is a motivational neurotransmitter, and that stimulates ingestive behavior. In a normal situation, a healthy individual, that triggers that, food intake. Food intake will go down through this into the small intestine, into the large intestine, and even in the, so the end of the small intestine. And then there's a series of cells in the GI tract that have hormones that are called anorexogenic hormones. So they turn off the appetite and the hunger, and they're stored there in what we call endocrine cells, enteroendocrine cells in the gut, and they're being released when they come in contact with food that you ingest. They get into the bloodstream, but they also act on the vagus nerve and then send a signal to the brain, and they counteract the orexogenic signals like ghrelin or insulin. So it's a feedback loop that normally works really well. So if you have a satiating meal, your appetite will turn off. And what we have learned that these cells in the gut that produce these anorexogenic signals, these satiety signals, they have receptors on the surface that respond to signals from the microbes, such as short chain fatty acids, or secondary bile acids, and several other metabolites. So the microbes play a big role in this, and not by coincidence, changes in the microbial composition and abundance has been identified in people with obesity and people with, what's been called food addiction, essentially where this craving for food becomes independent of the metabolic needs. So this uncoupling between the metabolic needs of the body that need to be satiated and appetite and craving is a hallmark of the current obesity epidemic.
So it sounds like the gut and the brain communicate through multiple channels. One of them is through the nervous system directly. So something like the vagus nerve is directly connecting the central nervous system and the gut to determine, what's going on in the gut at any given moment. There's also an endocrine connection. So there's hormones that get released from the gut into the bloodstream that go up to the brain. And in general, we can think about those as being either pro-hunger or pro-satiety signals. So something like ghrelin is basically going through the blood up to the brain and telling the brain, okay, we need food, orchestrate behavior accordingly. And then there's counteracting signals that do the opposite.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's these inhibitory mechanisms that normally would control a healthy food intake are compromised. Because microbes can play a role in excessively stimulating these. No, I shouldn't say this. If in not sufficiently stimulating these enteroendocrine cells, but there's also a component which has to do with the microbes playing a role in generating this system-wide immune activation, and these immune mediators have been shown to decrease the sensitivity of receptors for some of these satiety hormones. So not only is there an alteration at the gut level and this interaction between microbial signals and enterochromaffin cells, but there's also an alteration at the brain level in the hypothalamus that these hypothalamic receptors do not respond as well to the satiety hormones.
So the microbiome can actually impact the immune system. It's not surprising that the immune system would be tied to the microbiome, since our immune system is supposed to be basically communicating and detecting what microbes are doing in the body. But this can actually have a downstream impact on how our body is responding to its own hunger signals.
Absolutely. And I think this is what's sort of been evolving. So this integrated relationship between the diet that influences microbial composition, then the signaling of the microbes with our hormonal cells in the gut, these satiety hormone containing cells, the interaction of the microbes with the immune system in the gut. Because 70% of the immune system of our immune system cells are located in the gut, just microns away from the microbes in the center of the gut, and then that influencing our appetite and hunger regulating centers in the hypothalamus, and kind of uncoupling. So one thing that happens, in a situation like food addiction, so normally our craving for food and our motivated behavior to seek out, tasty foods is always constrained by this natural barrier of these systems that we talked about. If it becomes uncoupled, then the cortical centers, basically become unrestrained, and food intake is now driven by totally different motivations, by memories of food and by all the stuff that we see in advertisements, which creates these images and memories that then drive our food intake, not based on metabolic needs, but based on cortical, not on hypothalamic mechanisms, but on cortical and emotional centers within the brain.
Is this the distinction between what they call homeostatic versus hedonic regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a hallmark of food addiction. So I mean, some people have a problem calling this really an addiction, but I think it has many features, that this behavior, that you can compare to other situations of substance abuse and addictive behavior. But this is one of the hallmarks, that the hedonic component becomes dominant, and the homeostatic one is overridden by these hedonic impulses.
So in simple terms, food intake that's regulated homeostatically is sort of like the natural baseline way that hunger is regulated. You're eating because you actually feel hungry, because you actually have not eaten in a while. Whereas the hedonic component is eating something because you remember that it tastes really good and you just want that pleasure of eating it.
Yeah, and a good example, I mean, I've been on a lot of sort of mountaineering adventures, and like long distance hiking. And what you notice that after a couple of days, you switch completely to the homeostatic mechanism of food intake, because there's no possibility, like you can't take all your snacks and power bars to last you for 4 weeks on your hike. So you essentially just eat for your homeostatic needs, and which is actually very little, and you're not craving for food. You're focused on your hiking experience and the physical performance, and even though you need more, you're burning more calories, you don't have that craving for food all the time. It just completely switches. And I think what we see in our modern world, it's the opposite. That we spend so much time sitting, in so many people in front of the TV or in front of their iPhones, which is all time that does not really require or it's not influenced by the homeostatic needs of the body. They're minimal. So anything that people do is what they see on the commercial. They get up in the middle of their evening TV and go to the fridge and eat something, not for homeostatic needs, but because they saw that appealing advertisement on TV. So that's a good practical example.
So backing up a little bit to the microbiome, what is the microbiome? Is it just the full set of microbes that live inside of us?
It's the full set of microbes plus their genetic information, basically their function. So if you want to be really strict with the definition, so the microbiota are the players, the individual microbes, and that includes bacteria and viruses and fungi, with the bacteria being the most abundant. The other two groups we haven't really studied that well, but all three groups of microorganisms interact with each other. The microbiome is, if you add these, hundreds, millions of genetic information that microbes have, which essentially is representative for the functional capabilities that they have, most of which we don't really understand yet. But so microbiome is both the individual players, but also their products or their metabolites or their functions that they exert. And it's a very complex system. I think we're just really at the beginning of unraveling the complexity. And as I mentioned, the interactions, for example, of viruses, most of which are phages that feed on the microbes. So the relative abundances of microbes are partially influenced by your virome, but how many viruses and what type you have. And it's quite possible that, quite likely actually, that in 5-10 years, we will focus primarily on these viruses, as in terms of implicating them in some of the diseases that right now are sort of counted as microbiome related or as bacteria related.
So what are some of the major examples of, say, components of our diet that are broken down not by our own cells, but by microorganisms? And then on the flip side of that, what are some examples of metabolites that these organisms are producing that are doing very impactful things in our own bodies?
So, I mean, the main principle is that, microbes, and I have to admit, I'm not an expert on the virome, so I can't tell you that exactly. I mean, obviously the viruses feed on the microbes, so they're not really included in this. But in general, we have this interaction of the food that we eat with the microbiome. It's the main influence, and it's the components in the food that cannot be absorbed by our small intestine, but that go down towards the end of the small intestine, the ileum, and into the colon, where they're then broken down or metabolized by microbes into smaller, smaller components. Short chain fatty acids being sort of one of the most often talked about of these metabolites, because we know that they have a lot of beneficial effects on the gut and on the body and on the immune system. And then there's another group of molecules called polyphenols. So very large. They used to get a lot of attention some time ago as antioxidants, because people found if you put these large molecules into test tubes, they have an antioxidant effect on cells, on cultured cells, and or if they're injected into animals, the same thing. But in the meantime, we know that most of them, just like fiber, is the two large molecules. We don't have the mechanisms, the enzymes in the proximal small intestine to break them down and absorb them, so they all go down. And microbes have the ability to break down these polyphenols into smaller components and phenolic compounds, which can then be absorbed. So both of these major plant-based food components, the fiber and the polyphenols, have sort of a similar function. So they escape our absorption, so they don't get shortcut into our metabolism, and they have a beneficial effect on the microbes, on their composition, on their diversity, but also then the microbes turn them into molecules that are absorbable and have health benefits for us. The fiber components are at this point better understood than many of these phenolic compounds, but there's pretty good evidence that phenolic compounds, once they're absorbed, play a role either as antioxidants, but also other anti-inflammatory functions, like for example at the brain level. Mm-hmm. So the main connection between food, the microbes, and the metabolites, and then our health is sort of this chain of events. And I always say, the healthiest diet is one that's essentially targeted at the microbes. If you, it's a little bit extreme to say that, but I think it's pretty correct that if you only eat to the benefit of your microbes, you do the best thing for your body at the same time.
So basically, these microbes are breaking down stuff that we can't absorb or break down on our own. And in so doing that, they produce compounds that we actually can absorb and use and can have benefits in different ways.
Yeah, and the way this developed in evolution, food of our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, was very high in these unabsorbable food components. It was certainly unprocessed. Cooking became the first major way of processing food fermentation became another way of doing this. But our ancestors, in order to get enough calories, they were totally relying on this mechanism, on their microbes to break down these plant-based foods and turn them into short-chain fatty acids and provide energy for the body. Today, we're in a very different situation. Everything is ultra-processed. Everything gets rapidly absorbed in the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And, one of the reasons for our obesity epidemic is exactly that, how the food has changed from something that our bodies were specialized in breaking down, having broken down by the microbes, to something that's rapidly absorbed instantaneously when we eat it. Sugar is the best example, that a vast amount of our calories come from this rapidly absorbed sugar, not just sugar that we add to our coffee or to our cereals, the sugar, the high fructose corn syrup that's ubiquitous in our food. So, this completely changing the way what we ingest from something that was originally, we developed this unique symbiosis with the microbes to keep us alive and keep us fed. We've abandoned that system and we've completely switched it to the other one, and now are neglecting the microbial ecosystem with its own negative consequences.
I actually had not realized that about processed food. So processed food doesn't simply mean food that contains things that we don't find in nature or contains something artificial. It actually means that the food itself and what it does contain is absorbed earlier on in the digestive process, much more so than what our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have been experiencing.
Absolutely. Take a good example, the often maligned bread intake. If you look at some of the like the ancient cereals, it's now becoming popular again, certainly in Europe, that you can buy these breads made out of ancient cereals, and not from the processed wheat. So this is a good example. The original breads had so much fiber in them because of these grains, these ancient grains, that there was a lot of that bread that goes to the microbes. I don't know if you can say half of it, but then you take Wonder Bread, which is still being advertised on TV. I've recently seen this. It's amazing that this still happens. Hawaiian bread, which is this white, totally devoid of any fiber, ultra-processed bread, which will all be absorbed immediately when you eat it, and nothing goes further downstream.
So is it fair to say that highly processed food, when you eat highly processed food, you are effectively starving your microbiome?
That's correctly said. Yeah. So this is exactly that. And this is something that I think what we have seen in the last 75 years, increasingly with industrial food production. Starting with the kind of seeds and plants that we use. So the potatoes, are now optimized not based on their fiber content, like sweet potatoes that are essential part of the Okinawan healthy diet, which has a lot of fiber and goes down to the microbes, to the French fried potatoes that are, just ideal for making French fries, and that is the mostly consumed form now in the US, for example. So, and there's many examples that this wide variety of grains and plants has been reduced dramatically based on the interests of these big food processing companies that have conditioned the taste preferences of children, and sort of, this is still something I think we We see now changes in this. I mean, it's a good thing that everybody talks about gut health. And so, fiber is becoming sort of a major topic of this conversation. But it starts really way upstream. It starts with the selection of seeds and plants that are being used to make the food that we consume. And I always see this, when I travel in Europe, that in some countries they've made this. They've gone back much faster to using some of these old ingredients, much less selected, much less ultra processed than in the US.
Mm-hmm. So, if you're eating, the diet that you're eating can influence the composition of your microbiome. If you're eating a bad diet, whatever exactly that means, that can have bad consequences for your microbiome. I want to talk about at least one more way that we negatively impact our microbiome, and then I want to switch to how we can actually build it back up potentially. So I want to talk about antibiotics. Antibiotics are obviously much more prevalent today than they have been historically. So what is the effect of antibiotics that are common on our microbiome, and what do we know is going on there?
Yeah, so antibiotics are given, and this is really part of the problem. I mean, they've been the most effective therapy that modern medicine has ever developed. So millions of lives have been saved because of antibiotics. But the principle of antibiotics is that you declare war on a particular pathogen, on a particular strain of a microbe, like a particular strain of E. coli, for example. But at the same time, being willing to take the collateral damage on all the other microbial strains that you have in your gut. So it's a very, if this were warfare, it would be cluster bombs on civilian areas, just to catch one terrorist. So this is the comparison. And they've had a detrimental effect. What in proportion, how much the excessive use of antibiotics, what negative effect that this has had compared to the poor diet. I couldn't give you a number for that. It's for the interaction. But so they're shocking numbers, that the children by the age of 2 have received between 5 and 10 doses of broad spectrum antibiotics. Generally, well, for 2 reasons. Generally, because of overly worried mothers that take their infants to the pediatrician when they have a bad cold, and they say something has to be done. I need an antibiotic. I've seen this many times. Mm-hmm. That mothers. Friends have come to me. They can make a prescription for an antibiotic. The other one is that we have used antibiotics, for example, during the whole the time of delivery. So women get prophylactic antibiotics in the delivery room to prevent serious infections, which do happen in some women. But so life already starts for an infant coming out of the birth canal, being exposed to antibiotics, because these antibiotics have affected the maternal microbiome, which first comes in contact with the infant. So yeah, antibiotics, particularly early in life, because the development or the programming of the microbiome happens during the first 3 years of life. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously the worst time to use these broad spectrum antibiotics, for non-indications. So none of these viral diseases obviously are affected by that.
Yeah, no, I think we probably all have examples in our life. I certainly can think of some where, someone has a cold, which is caused by a virus, and they just go to the doctor and demand an antibiotic, and they typically get it, just because it's probably irritating for the doctor to keep hearing it.
They typically get it. And what's also interesting is, some kids get better, and it's pretty more a placebo effect because, we do know that antibiotics do not affect viruses. So if you take an antibiotic and believe this is really powerful, you will feel better. There's no question. So,
and I did want to. So you mentioned the idea of the microbiome getting set up very early on, before birth and during birth. Can you talk a little bit more about how that initial microbiome is normally established in a young child? And then also, are there any clear links between antibiotics early in life, alterations in the microbiome, and then, childhood obesity or other metabolic issues?
Yeah, so this is a complicated topic because this programming is quite complex. So it starts, you could almost go back to a situation, before the child is born, because the microbiome of the mother will produce metabolites and signaling molecules and inflammatory substances that affect the developing fetus. So there's already an exposure to the microbial world, even though the fetus does not have its own microbiome. It's been controversial, but most likely not. It is already exposed to microbial products from the mother, and that may play a big role in diseases like autism spectrum, which starts really in utero. Then, when the infant is born, it goes through the birth canal, or at least still in the majority of women. And it comes in contact with a sort of a mixture of microbes from the intestinal tract of the mother, from the rectum and the vagina, and that's the first inoculation of this sterile environment, sterile gut environment of the newborn. That is influenced by, we know this mainly from animal experiments, is influenced if the mother has taken an antibiotic, because then that affects the mother's vaginal microbiome and the intestinal. But also if the mother is chronically stressed. So there's fascinating studies that have shown that that chronic stress in mice changes the vaginal microbiome. And so the newborn mice get inoculated by a very different microbial population than in non-stressed mice. So the antibiotic exposure of the mother and the stress level of the mother have a major influence in this early inoculation. Then it continues. So breast milk has molecules in it, these human milk oligosaccharides. That's another category of these molecules that are too big to be absorbed by the small intestine. And so in evolution, they were designed not for nutrition for the newborn, but targeted at the microbiome, at the evolving microbiome. These human milk oligosaccharides are influenced again by the diet and the genetics of the mother. Multiple connections, between the mother and this development of the infant microbiome. So C-sections, which have become increasingly popular in some parts of the world, I think in Italy and Brazil leading that trend. Up to 60% of women, I think, undergo C-section deliveries. And that has been shown that, a C-section delivered baby will have an increased risk for developing asthma, for example, and obesity. Even though the microbiome normalizes. So if you take an infant that was born by C-section and one by vaginally delivered, after a year, their microbiome composition looks very similar. They sort of adapts. But the programming that has happened during their first year has occurred, and it takes, for example, the immune system in a different direction. Because during that first year, it's not just the microbiome, it's also the immune system interaction with these microbes. So just the fact that, after a year we have the same, you could trivialize it and say it's not such a big deal because, after a year, both types of babies are, basically have the same microbiome. That's not correct, because that year of altered microbial immune interaction will leave a memory and will leave a less competent immune system that manifests later in life, with autoimmune diseases and allergies. And then, so the other one is, formula feeding versus breastfeeding. I've sort of learned this, had no idea about this. So in 100 years ago, for wealthy people, women didn't want to breastfeed and actually hired nannies to breastfeed their children. Or, formula feeding that happened in many parts of Africa. So this was sold as a good substitute for breastfeeding. So that also leaves a big trace on a negative trace on the microbiome, because it did not get these molecules, these human milk oligosaccharides that were essential in setting up the ecosystem of the adult microbiome. So there's a lot of things that then we talked about the antibiotics that interfere with that process. And so, yeah, it's something that has not, I think, has not received enough attention by pediatricians and by OBGYN physicians and by young mothers, how important that early phase is. So it's not just, getting enough nutrients to the baby and calories. It's really nurturing the microbiome and optimizing this programming phase for later in life. And all these factors combined that we have interfered with in the modern world probably play a big role in our current health problems, from obesity to autoimmune diseases so the autoimmune diseases, in addition to all the metabolic complications, are another manifestation of a compromised microbiome.
One of the things that I'm interested in learning about here is, my understanding is that there's some striking experiments in rodents and experimental animals where maybe you sort of wipe out the microbiome using broad spectrum antibiotics, and then you actually replace that animal's microbiome with that from another animal. Are there any striking examples where that kind of microbiome transplantation is sufficient to either induce or cure some kind of disease?
Yeah, up to date, there's only one disease where this has really clearly been demonstrated to be effective, and this is a particular form of post-antibiotic complication, C. difficile colitis, where some people sort of, after a course of antibiotic, wipe out their microbiome and develop life-threatening colon inflammation or colitis. That's typically been treated with certain antibiotics, but it's been found that a fecal microbial transplant is the best short-term and long-term treatment for this condition. And probably the reason that this works and that this is the only disease where this works is because you have already wiped out your own microbial ecosystem through this process of developing this colitis. So now when you come in with a transplant, it can start from scratch, and basically it will go back to your original design of your ecosystem. So there is a transition phase where the donor of this transplant, these microbes will dominate your own ecosystem composition. But this transition phase, you'll basically return to your own original programmed microbiome. So the blueprint, so even though your microbiome has been wiped out by the antibiotic-associated colitis, the blueprint was not destroyed, and the gut rebuilds that same population after a while. This has not been successful in many other diseases. So it's been tried in obesity, it's been tried in inflammatory bowel disease, been tried in some psychiatric diseases, and it's not happened because all of these, it's also been tried in autism spectrum, and I'll say something about this in a minute. In all these other diseases, you don't have this initial complete destruction of the ecosystem. So you have a bad microbiome, a compromised microbiome, but it's still, that system is still resilient enough to exclude any newcomer to settle in that. So this is called colonization resistance. So it will not allow any newcomer from a transplant to set foot and stay there. There's one, so this is the current state of the knowledge. There's an interesting example of studies with autism spectrum disorder where a sort of a modified technique has been used. So using an initial application of a broad spectrum antibiotic to knock down as much as possible the autistic microbiome, and then doing a series, multiple transplants over time to recolonize it. And that has been shown to be both largely in uncontrolled studies. So this is the big question mark. But it's been shown to change improve the symptoms, both the mental, but also the GI symptoms of these kids. But also it's been shown to change the microbial ecosystem composition. And even after follow-up, after 1 year, I think it was 1 or 2 years, these benefits were still seen. So this would almost indicate that is a way that you can, at least over a period of a couple of years, influence and change and correct this altered microbiome of characteristic of autism spectrum children. I think in the future, people are working on techniques, and there could be molecular biology or gene manipulation to overcome this colonization resistance, so that you have microbes that are identical to normal gut microbes, but where you manipulate the genes so they can overcome this colonization resistance of the ecosystem. That would have obviously huge potentials for the treatment of many diseases, both in psychiatry and in metabolic diseases. The risk of something like that is always, this colonization resistance has a good reason why we have that, because we wouldn't want, anytime we have an enteric infection, that these pathogens can settle in our microbiome and stay there. So you want a system that's it's almost like the custom system, in a country. You don't want anybody to come in uncontrolled and settle there. You want to have some close regulation of that process. And if you mess with that process that evolution has established, there's always the risk that this could go in the other direction.
So it sounds like we normally have a kind of baseline microbiome with a certain population composition that our body will have a tendency to always go back to. And there's actually this, you're mentioning this concept of colonization resistance. So, the microbiome that's native to our body is going to want to prevent other microbes from just getting in there. Does that have implications for how we think about things like probiotics and their ability to actually change our microbiome? And, can you start talking about probiotics generally? Do they actually work most of the time? Do the products out there have the right bacteria in them? What should people know about that?
Yeah, so your first part of the question is easier to answer. So these probiotics in general, for the majority of people, do not overcome colonization resistance. So after 24 to 48 hours, you take a dose of a probiotic, it's gone from your gut. It does not change your originally programmed ecosystem. There's some exceptions, and some people that actually are allowed to colonize. I don't know what the factors are, and can't really give you a detailed explanation for that. But in general, it is important. If you believe in probiotics, you would have to take them on a regular basis. It may also be possible that so there's obviously multiple strains and species of probiotics. Humans started to develop fermented foods some at least 40,000 years ago, not for health reasons, but for reasons to preserve food, and allow them to travel long distances and colonize other, parts of the world. So 40,000 years, that's long enough for our own microbiome and our own genes to adapt to that exposure. So it's quite possible that many of the strains that are part of naturally fermented foods, be it, fermented vegetables, fish, dairy products, or anything else, are allowed, do not have the problem of colonization resistance. I can't give you an answer, and I don't even know if that has been studied with all these different strains. But it's certainly, for me personally, a reason why I recommend to patients, if you believe in probiotics, consume them with naturally fermented foods if you have access to them. There was a study, interesting study, kind of controversial, was received with a lot of criticism and suspicion, came out of the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv, where they found that after an antibiotic course, people that got a cocktail of probiotics, in some of them, it took longer to reconstitute the pre-antibiotic microbial ecosystem, the healthy ecosystem, than the ones that did not get the probiotic cocktail. So that it would actually delay or compete with the natural microbes to come back. If that's, obviously this ran into a lot of opposition from all the probiotic manufacturers. I do not know where that field stands. I've not seen a reversal or these findings being refuted, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. So most importantly, I would say, if you believe in probiotics and you take them and you notice a significant benefit for you, you may either be somebody where these microbes are allowed to settle in your gut, or you have been taking them on a regular basis, and not just for a few weeks and then stop taking them because they will not have a long-term effect. In the future, then you asked me the question, so which of these probiotics, there's obviously hundreds being promoted on the internet and by companies. Each one is sort of celebrated as the most potent and the most evidence-based. Well, the evidence is very, very limited. The kind of rigor that we apply to new medications, for example, randomized controlled trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, for the great majority of probiotics has never happened and probably will never happen. It's too expensive. And I think a lot of the people companies that sell these products would be afraid that it would show that, there's no benefit compared to the placebo group. So these studies are not being done. I've been involved a couple of times in a process where, scientists showed animal studies where this had a major effect on brain health and depression-like behavior. Then, these were industry-sponsored preclinical studies. Then there was sort of a big plan to do a worldwide randomized controlled trial, phase 2 or phase 3. And I've seen this twice now, different companies. those studies were canceled in the last minute, and no reason is given, but my feeling is the main reason is the risk of having negative results was too high to justify the expense of hundreds of millions of dollars for trials like that. Or it would show the negative thing, and then it would kill this compound for any commercial purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I can just imagine the marketing teams at these companies right now. It's like you already have the one animal study that seems to show something positive. You can just point to that, and
you can say it's evidence-based, it's science-based, and that's what everybody's using. And I think there may be another, there may be a whole other series of probiotics on the horizon, and we see some of those. So, for example, I've interacted with a group in Canada that developed a bioengineered microbial strain that produces short-chain fatty acids in high amounts, and they were able to knock out the gene that is responsible for this colonization resistance. So these microbes would actually settle in the gut and have a much more profound effect on the ecosystem. Another one would be beneficial microbes that are high short chain fatty acid or like butyrate producers that or producers, for example, of GABA, this neurotransmitter that could have anxiolytic effects. These microbes have already been engineered and have undergone some testing. Some of them are on the market, like for short chain fatty acid producers, but others, like the GABA producing, has not made it into any commercial application. Because probably there were concerns about either do you reach high enough concentrations in the brain from microbial produced GABA, or so I think there will be a new generation of probiotics. How popular they will be with the public, like genetically engineered microbes in your gut. So obviously a lot of resistance to that concept. And so, but we'll have to see that there is enough, startup companies are working in that space that we'll see some of these.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned briefly that some people might be unusual and their guts may be more readily colonizable by certain microbes. How much variation is there from person to person in microbiome composition? Is there a lot of variability? And how easily changeable or tunable might that composition be from person to person?
Yeah, so there's a huge variability, inter-individual variability. So if you compare it with genetic, variability, which, we're so similar to each other and even to a mouse next to us. But in terms of the microbes, particularly if you go down to the strain level, so if the different classifications of taxa of microbes, if you start at the highest level, so almost everybody has like three main taxa: Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, and the third group of microbes. Almost everybody has those. If you go down another level to the species, you'll see that this similarity will go way down. And if you go to the strain level, it's been estimated that only 10% are shared by individuals with each other. So it depends a lot at what level you look at. Ultimately, it depends on the strains. Because if you think about E. coli, the species of E. coli, there's strains that are deadly, enterotoxigenic E. coli, and there are strains that are commensal, so highly beneficial to our gut microbial composition. So I think, many of the early studies, the majority have stopped at best at the species level. Many of them didn't go deeper than the genus level. And so the results that came out of these studies kind of misleading. It's I think with the more sophisticated techniques that we use today, metagenomic analysis or transcriptomic analysis, you get to a much finer grain of differentiating, the different players and different products generate within the microbiome. And it's so the second part of your question was how, maybe you want to repeat it, how we can change it.
Yeah, like how changeable is it? Based on what you've said so far, it's sort of sounding like it's relatively difficult to change the composition of the microbiome unless you do something relatively drastic, like go on a broad spectrum antibiotic.
Yeah, so this is something that has really changed this concept over time. We know, for example, there's a certain bandwidth that it's changeable. So, we can't, if you compare our gut microbiome with that of the remnants of hunter-gatherers in Africa, the Hasta, or with the Yanomami on the Orinoco, our diversity and richness is way down, and will continue to decrease based on these lifestyle changes in modern societies that we talked about earlier. But that doesn't mean that we're doomed on this downhill course of our gut microbial health. There's a certain bandwidth. I think this is how people currently conceptualize this. There's a certain bandwidth that we can either improve it, but not get to the level of our ancestors. But we certainly, there's much leeway to make it even worse. So it is changeable. The change happens, can be intergenerational. So if one, for example, it's been shown in animals, if one generation of animals is fed a low fiber diet, then microbial diversity goes down. The offspring, if the offspring again is fed such a diet, it will go further down. If you try to intervene after the first generation, you may be able to bring it back to its original richness and diversity. But after the second generation, that's no longer possible. And I think we may be seeing, it's always hard to extrapolate from mouse studies to the human situation, but we may be seeing something similar, that there has been this progressive decrease in the health of the gut microbiome system that will not be able to reverse that completely, but certainly we can stop further decline, and we can go up a certain level within the bandwidth of variability. Certainly, there's studies have shown rapid response to dietary changes, from carnivore to vegan, pretty dramatic change of both the individual microbial abundances, but also the metabolites that they produce. This is in the short term. But if these people would go back to their original diet, it would switch back to to their original composition. So there's definitely, the good news is, and that's really important for recommendations for healthy diets. The good news is you can stop further deterioration. You can improve the situation over its current baseline. If there is a possibility then over generations to rebuild it, I don't think that's known yet. I've not seen that, and that may be different in humans than in mice. But there's certainly reason for optimism and justification for a aggressive campaign for gut microbial friendly diets and a restoration of the ecosystem.
So there definitely is some response of the microbiome to the diet we're eating. I did want to ask you about different diets. So on the one hand, our diet like must obviously impact our metabolic health and things like microbiome composition. On the other hand, dieting is a very frustrating and annoying topic to a scientist, I think, and to a lot of people, because every week there's a new diet book out that claims to be the best diet for whatever, and a lot of it is clearly garbage mixed in with partial truth, mixed in with actual factual statements. So it's very difficult, even for an educated person, to make heads or tails of the whole dieting industry and what they can follow good advice for. So can you talk a little bit about a couple different popular areas of dieting and whether or not there's any clear evidence that they impact things like the microbiome? The one I want to ask you about first, because it's related to the stories you were telling us from your mountaineering adventures, is intermittent fasting. So it started to sound like you were saying that the body can sort of switch modes or regimes of metabolism and be less anchored in the hedonic signals that we're getting in the modern world and go back to mostly paying attention to homeostatic hunger signals if you just sort of remove yourself from having food all over the place. So does that tie into intermittent fasting and whether or not that can actually have benefits on our health?
Yeah, so, intermittent fasting has received a lot of attention recently. I personally like to sort of break this up into the truly intermittent fasting and the time-restricted eating, because I think is a significant difference between those two. So with time-restricted eating, which is a technique that I think is practical, is realistic, almost everybody can do this, where you don't limit the amount of food that you eat, but you compress the feeding time, the eating time, into 8 hours or less if you can, and leave the gut empty for 16 hours. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of theoretical and preclinical reasons or evidence to support that. So one is, if you go to let's say you 16 hours of non-eating, a big portion of that happens during your sleep. So at least half of that happens during your sleep. And so you switch the whole physiology of your GI tract. You switch the contraction patterns from one of peristalsis and mixing and grinding to a regular, almost like clockwork sequence, that every 90 minutes you have a big contractile wave starting in the esophagus, going all the way down to the end of your intestine. And that wave used to be called the housekeeper of the gut. We didn't really know when this first was detected. This was like when I started my career in this field, that this was first reported by investigators at the Mayo Clinic. So it was thought to clean the GI tract of all debris and undigestible food, but that's probably not the main function of it. If you imagine the microbes living in these different communities all along the gut, it puts them back into the right place, and it regulates the abundance in different parts of the gut. Like in the small intestine, you want to have a very low concentration of these microbes in the proximal small intestine, and a little bit higher in the distal, and highest in the colon. So what this wave does, it puts everybody back into place. It's almost like cleaning up at the end of a busy day, in a restaurant. That seems to be a very important part of regulating the ecosystem. And there's different parts. These ecosystems are regionally specialized. You don't have the same ecosystem all the way through your gut. Mm-hmm. It's different in the small intestine, distal, small intestine, large intestine. So that's one thing. It also, this wave affects the secretion, affects blood flow, but it also has been shown now to affect the what's called the geography of the microbes towards your gut lining and the cells that make up your gut lining and the immune cells. So during the fasting, you have a greater distance So there's less of that signaling that goes from the microbes to the rest of the body. Then, during the feeding time. So both in terms of the ecosystem localization, relative abundances, and the geography of the microbes in relationship to your gut lining is altered during this, non-eating phase. And we have almost abandoned this in our modern lifestyle, snacking in front of the TV till midnight or after midnight, and then having snacking throughout the day. The whole food bar industry is essentially a way of eliminating that mechanism, that regulatory mechanism from because the minute you put something in your mouth, it will stop that cleaning process. So this is, and I would say, there's very convincing mouse experiments that mice could be fed a very unhealthy, what's called cafeteria diet, on which they would gain weight and develop metabolic disturbances. If they are fed ad libitum, they can have access to the food all the time. But when they're switched to this time-restricted eating, they can consume the same diet, but will not show these negative consequences. So I think it's something, so we've tried this in our own family during the pandemic, during the stay-home phase. It's something that takes some discipline, not to, snack or have your glass of wine in the evening after dinner. But after a while, it sort of becomes a pretty natural state. And it definitely on our self-experiment has shown, beneficial effects on pretty significant loss of weight. Now, there are several studies out now. There's a lot of studies in animals, which are all positive. So a few studies out in humans, some of which are positive, others are negative, did not show a benefit. So the final word on that is still out. So this is all about time-restricted eating. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go to intermittent fasting, obviously a much more difficult thing to do for the average person, unless you're spiritually motivated or, have a very high discipline.
So would this be intermittent fasting? Would that be having multiple days where you're not eating in a row?
Yeah. And, people have used different patterns. So some people go on 1 week fasts or just water during a 1 week fast, or some go on 2 days a week, 1 day a week, one fasting day. I just think, being at work, like most people are, it's just like you can do this for the length of a clinical trial for a 4-week period, but there's evidence that many of these techniques, if you look at them after a year, will not be sustained, and obviously you lose. Then it's particularly bad because people lose weight on these dietary interventions. Then if you stop it, many have this yo-yo effect where then the weight increases above your baseline weight even. So you make things even worse. So, but I think, if you have the discipline, if you live a monastic life, the fasting is very, very important thing because it does affect the brain and your mind and consciousness. But for the average person, I just don't think that these techniques are realistic.
What do people tend to report if they go on a multi-day fast? I've heard that usually the first day or two, you basically get very irritable and you're probably not fun to be around. But then after that, you have other kinds of mental and behavioral changes. Yeah, so people say that, they feel better, they have more energy, they've lost their brain fog, improved their concentration, so many positive things. And, that could be attributed. So what happens during this fasting is that you switch your main metabolic mode to a state of ketosis. So you're burning ketone bodies instead of sugar for your energy. And
ketone bodies, from your fat stores. And so typically, when people go on a ketogenic diet, they actually eat or to try to live primarily on animal products, fat and protein. But fasting essentially forces the body to do something very similar, without ingesting unhealthy aspects of a diet, which I think most of these animals, particularly if you consume them in high amounts. So if you look at it this way, and this is just really from self-experimentation, I have to say, I haven't seen the study. So if you go into intermittent fasting during that 16-hour not having food in your stomach, and particularly if you exercise, you get up in the morning, you exercise on empty stomach, you will have a certain degree of ketosis and burning ketone bodies instead of sugar, because there's no, ingested carbohydrates that you can burn. So if you extend that period by having your first meal of the day, which is typically at 11 or noon, being of plant-based fats and protein, without carbs. So these would be seeds and this would be mainly seeds, different types of seeds, and then you can actually expand that time of ketosis. So this is what we have switched to. So we are actually on a ketogenic mode for more than the 16 hours. We're probably on that mode for 20 hours a day. And again, we've not done a study on this. I've never seen a study on this, but from what I know, I would imagine that this is probably the best way that you can use this ketosis principle for your own health without, at the same time, eating a healthy diet, because your second big meal should be a highly varied plant-based diet with multiple fiber providing vegetables and fruit. So yeah, for me personally, I'm against the ketogenic diet for many reasons, environmental, but also health-wise. But I think utilizing that principle of a switching to a ketogenic mode during this not intermittent fasting, the time-restricted eating is probably a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So just to summarize, intermittent fasting, much harder to implement just because it's not as practical. You have to go multiple days without eating. But what you're effectively doing with intermittent fasting is putting your body into a state of ketosis, which is the same thing that people achieve when they go on this ketogenic diet that's high in animal fat and protein.
Yeah.
And the difference between that and the time-restricted feeding is that if you're doing time-restricted feeding, you just have to pick a start time and a stop time every day and stick to it, 16 hours without food. But it sounded like it really has to be 16 hours without anything except water, not even like a glass of wine or a glass of juice. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's the hard part. It's not, most people have their dinner, by 7, 8 at the latest, and they don't really feel like they want to have another meal. But the snacking and alcohol, that's the hardest part to so you essentially change your lifestyle, and we have sort of come up with this idea that you don't have to do this 100%, because if you travel, if you go to a Mediterranean country or to Argentina, mm-hmm. you don't want to live like that for these 2 weeks that you're traveling there, because you're missing out on the best part of their culture, mm-hmm. Eating outdoor restaurants at 11 at night. But at home, related, you can easily build this into your work schedule. It's something, it's something feasible without making a religion. We also found, when we invite friends over, obviously you don't say after 8 o'clock there's not a glass of wine or a glass of beer. So you don't have to be religious about this. You should be religious for most of the time, but don't sacrifice your social life or your enjoyment of other things because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good advice. During the work week, when you're at home and you're not traveling or whatever, stick to something, but you can let things slip beyond that as long as you're doing it some of the time. You mentioned the Mediterranean diet effectively, or the Mediterranean culture. And I did want to ask you about the so-called Mediterranean diet. Is that, because that's one of the ones that you hear about all the time. Is that even really a thing? And if so, what is the composition of that diet? And is there any evidence of any positive health benefits of that type of diet?
Yeah, so, what it is, it started with these early studies of the famous paper by Ansel Keys, or a report that was solicited by the Rockefeller Foundation, where he studied people in Crete in the, I think it was in the early 60s. And this was obviously a very different situation of kind of low income people who could not afford a lot of meat. So they had a diet that was high in vegetables and fruits, which were cheaper, easily available, with some meat, usually goat meat, and some poultry. And when he compared the health outcomes of people in Crete with other populations in Europe, they saw in this cross-sectional epidemiological studies, significant health benefits. Now, this could have been confounded by a lot of different factors. And obviously, that diet in the early 60s in Crete is not what you get today when you travel in Italy or Spain, or if you go to an Italian restaurant, which has been dramatically changed. So I usually say the health benefits of a traditional Mediterranean diet, which is more similar to, high in could be high in fat, in plant fat, olive oil primarily, seeds and nuts, and different types of seasonal vegetables and fruits, and low in red meat and dairy products. But there's now many cross-sectional epidemiological case control studies that have been done and have confirmed that not only this seems to be beneficial or has a decreased risk for morbidities, cardiovascular disease, psychiatric, like depression, metabolic disease. So the evidence for that is pretty strong. These are not most of these are not longitudinal studies. Most of them would not allow you to say anything about the causality, that clearly these better health outcomes were directly caused by that diet. But significant circumstantial evidence that it's the case. And so there's a few recent studies that have actually looked at an intervention. So with a control group and following individuals up for a while. And some of these studies have really proven that people on this diet both have a favorable microbiome profile and metabolites, and lower inflammatory markers in the brain, lower metabolites that we know play a role in the pathophysiology of many brain disorders. And that, so they looked at frailty and cognitive decline in these people, and it had a positive effect on those as well, on those clinical outcomes. So I would say that, and there are studies going on in, early Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, in many both medical and psychiatric diseases. And my guess is they will generally confirm the benefits of that diet. Mm-hmm. And so But for many of the other studies, the evidence is much less strong, mainly because there haven't been that many studies done in that same rigorous way. So there's smaller studies that show certain benefits for the ketogenic diet in terms of metabolic regulation. Yeah, clearly, if you go on a 4-week ketogenic diet, you will improve your hemoglobin A1C. You will, improve systemic immune activation. But if you do this for a year or longer, it will have negative. These positive effects will be overshadowed by negative effects because you're essentially starving your gut microbiome, and it's that, which we know is an unhealthy thing.
So switching gears a little bit, your latest book is about the interaction between the gut and the immune system. Is that accurate?
This new book coming out, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything you want to say about that book and what's inside of it that people might find interesting given all the things that we've touched on here?
Yeah, so it's clearly building on my first book, The Mind-Gut Connection. But it takes it, so a lot of things have happened in those 5 years science-wise. And it sort of really focused on this phenomenon that, that diet influences our microbiome, which then has an effect on how the microbiome interacts with our gut-based immune system, and how the gut-based immune system then sends inflammatory signals throughout the body to other organs, all our other organs, the liver, the colon, the brain, the heart, and how those those immune signals, together with other chemical signals from the microbes, play a major role in many of these diseases. I focus again on brain diseases, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism spectrum, but mention that how closely these links that we see to other disorders like cardiovascular and metabolic and cancer, but I'm not going into the detail of these. So at the core of this concept is that the microbes, diverse microbiome, plays a big role in generating and maintaining the barrier between the microbes and the immune system in the gut, initially in form of the mucus layer that many microbes interact with specialized cells in the gut. Goblet cells produce this mucus, which is the first layer of insulation, and then the gut epithelial layer, the second line, and how a dietary compromised gut microbiome leads progressively to a compromised insulation between microbes and the immune system. So that's where the problem starts. That compromised microbiome could come from either the poor diet, many examples for the standard American diet, high in sugar, high in ultra-processed foods, low in fiber, high in animal-based fats. But there's also another factor that plays a big role, which is the descending influences from the brain. So chronic stress, what's called allostasis, chronic engagement of the stress system in the brain, has very similar effects on this barrier. It increases the permeability of the leakiness of this gut barrier, the mucus layer and the epithelial layer. So in our modern lifestyle, we have, unfortunately, a combination of both the chronic stress, increase in chronic stress levels, and the worsening of the diet, which interact and obviously create the worst possible scenario. And we see, with increasing rates of depression, on the one side, we have this increased rate of poor digestive health, but they converge on something that is a common denominator. Then also another thing that I come up then from this with this recommendation, a healthy diet is one that keeps in mind, first of all, the health of your gut microbiome. So, which means, largely plant-based food. The other one is that when you select your diet, you have to ask 3 questions: what do you eat, when you eat it, and where does the food come from? Because there's a lot of changes in the way modern industrial agriculture has changed food production, and we will see even worse things coming down the pipeline with aquaponics, vegetables and fruits grown in water and no longer in soil. So there's no longer an exposure to the microbes in the soil, which play a big role in stimulating the health-promoting molecules, these polyphenols in the plants. And then also the impact of your diet on, not just on, soil health, but also on environmental health, with a major impact that the constantly increasing consumption of animal products, what this has on deforestation and monocultures and use of pesticides and herbicides. So it takes it from the microbes and microbial health all the way to soil health and planetary health, and the concept I like to call the One Health concept.
So we've touched on it a little bit, but one of the last things I want to ask you is, to what extent and how all of your research and all of your studies over the past few decades has influenced your own dieting habits? What do you have, like a basic routine and set of rules that you follow in terms of time restricted eating and the composition of your diet, whether it's more plant-based or animal-based? I think you've sort of hinted at it along the way, but can you summarize for everyone how you approach dieting and how you think about your strategies?
Yeah, and I've had a pretty dramatic change in my dietary habits from when I was a student living primarily on animal products, both, and, growing up in Munich in southern Germany, this was certainly not the place known for its healthiest diet. And maybe not as much processed meats as you would get here, but certainly, I was mainly thriving and completely unconscious. I have to say this, probably the most important thing. I was really living the way that a large number of people live, without having thoughts and a conscious awareness of, this whole topic that we have been talking about, where does this food come from? How is it grown? So then I was not trained as a gastroenterologist in any aspect of diet or nutrition, not a single hour. When in my early research, it was always the brain-gut interaction, not really with the microbes and with the role of food in this process. But when I wrote my first book, this was the eureka moment, really, when I went through all this literature. And once you start thinking about the microbes, you cannot avoid getting deep into the diet and into nutrition. And with the first book, that was not as extreme as it was the second time, because in the meantime, through the promotion of my book, I got to know and got to speak, got invited to many places that, as a regular gastroenterologist, I would have never encountered before. Audiences, questions like the ones we're having right now. In my early career, I would have not had this conversation with you. And I've met people like in regenerative organic agriculture, really understanding what that means and how important organic has become in a situation where you recommend a largely plant-based diet. So if it's not organically grown, you consume a vast amount of pesticides and chemicals that are now used to grow these foods. So my awareness has kept increasing about paying attention to it. So today, we've switched to a largely plant-based diet. I mean, the only meat source is fish once a week and chicken once a week. All the rest is plant-based. lots of varied fruits and vegetables, and also paying a lot of attention. So paying a lot of attention on the labels of food, which in the past I've not really done that much, and also going beyond that, finding out places that sell food that has been grown in a regenerative organic way, or at least in an organic way, in an environmentally friendly way. How far away is this being produced? I don't, we used to, just to make sure that we get our blueberries, eat them all year, coming from places like Chile. And so we don't do this anymore. So we, have adjusted this to mainly to locally grown products, which means seasonally adjusted. So it's a long process. I don't know, certainly in Southern California, there's a lot of consciousness about all these things now. And there's a lot of, in the media. I don't know how widespread that kind of process is really in the general US population. It's very prevalent in Europe. I think people ask a lot of these questions. So a larger portion of the population is sensitized to ask these, many of these questions. But it's not simple. I mean, you have to dedicate part of your attentional capacity to food that before you would just, when you buy a hamburger, obviously there's no need to think about it, what this does and where it comes from, and how many trees have been cut down to, have cheap soybeans for the cows that are going to this hamburger. So once you develop this, so this has happened to us. And I think it will increase. It's not a static thing. I think it's a constant learning process. And the good sides are I see progress. So at least in Southern California and the audiences that I interact with, I hope the word will spread, throughout the country and throughout the world. And it's certainly something that I've dedicated a lot of energy with my books, for example, which are equally a call to action for, environmental health as they are for gut health and gut microbial health.
All right. Well, this is a fascinating area, and it sounds like it's a fast-moving area of research. So you're going to have to write a new book every 5 years. But very excited to see your new book come out. So remind everyone one more time the name of your old book, the name of the new one.
So the old one is The Mind-Gut Connection, and the new one is The Gut-Immune Connection. And as I said, the second one builds on some of the concepts of the first one, but with a lot more new science and taking it beyond the gut into the soil, plant health, planetary health, and environment. So it sort of reflects my own process of growth in this area. And I'm very excited that this, quite honestly, in the beginning, when I thought about writing a second book, the main question was, is there enough space in a very crowded field now of, self-declared microbiome gut health experts who published books? And so once I came up with this concept of the One Health idea, that really energized me, and I think something came out that is very novel that a lot of people have not really seen and concentrated in one book.
Excellent. Well, this is a fascinating area. I'll link to it in the episode description for everyone to find easily. Professor Emeran Mayer, thank you for joining us.
Nick, it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it as well.